I found the note from my wife's lover inviting her to dinner, so I followed her and caught them together. They weren't expecting that. In fact, I didn't even expect it. Because deep down, I still thought it was all a misunderstanding, a delusion of mine, an exaggerated mistrust. I refused to believe that the woman who slept with me every night, who said she loved me, who smiled when she prepared dinner, who hugged me on lazy Sundays and who wrote sweet notes on napkins could also write this, today, 8 p.m., at the restaurant only we know. I'm counting down the minutes until I see you again. The handwriting was hers. The one on the note was his. And I followed them both. I sat silently at a nearby table, far enough away so they wouldn't see me, close enough so that every laugh, every touch, every whisper was like a blade. The glass of wine she raised in front of him was just like the one we toasted the night we bought our house. The same smile she gave as she leaned into him had been mine for so many years. And the way she touched her hair. Identical to what he did when he wanted to seduce me. But there was nothing left of mine. It was as if I had been erased from her life. An invisible spectator of a story that should be mine. The waiter asked if I wanted anything. I refused. I wouldn't be able to swallow anything. I just wanted to see. I needed to see it to the end. Not because I doubted it, but because, in some sick way, I wanted to feel all the pain that moment could cause me. I wanted to hurt myself with that. I wanted to bleed inside. Seeing them toasting, their complicit looks, their fingers touching on the table. And then, her laugh. That laugh. My God, that laugh. The same one she gave when I asked her to marry me. The same one she used to promise me that she would be mine forever. At that moment, I understood that promises don't mean anything. That, forever, can have a set date and time to end. And it was that night, in that restaurant, on that table covered in candles and lies, that my forever died. They got up. She discreetly looked around, as if wanting to make sure no one saw them. They smiled. They left hand in hand, but let go as soon as they stepped onto the sidewalk. A care they didn't take with me. As if I were incapable of noticing. As if I were blind. I followed them to the hotel, parked the car a few meters behind and stood there, motionless, watching the two disappear through the revolving door. I felt my stomach drop. And it wasn't out of anger, not yet. It was mourning. There, I didn't just lose a wife. I lost years of my life. I lost what I believed was love. I lost trust in everything that was solid. I returned home not knowing what to do. The house was intact, every detail of our daily lives perfectly in place, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't been emotionally murdered that night. The bottle of wine we opened on our last birthday was still in the cellar. The flowers I gave on Mother's Day, dried but preserved, were in the living room. The portrait of our trip to Tuscany rested on the shelf, right next to the rings that we had engraved with the phrase, "Where you go, I go." That morning, I slept on the couch. Not for lack of bed, but for lack of courage. Courage to lie down next to her without suffocating. The next day, she came back with a fake smile on her lips, as if she had gone to dinner with friends. And I pretended not to know. I pretended as well as she pretended to love me. I pretended because I needed time. And it was during that time that I created something bigger. Something beyond pain. An answer. Because there are betrayals that deserve more than tears. They deserve theater. And mine was just beginning. Over the next few days, I continued to be the perfect husband. Affectionate, present, attentive. I brought her flowers, prepared her breakfast, sent her messages in the middle of the day saying how much I loved her. And she responded with the same hypocrisy. I started to observe every detail. The tone of voice when talking on the cell phone. The way she dressed up to go to the market. The different perfumes I wore when I returned home. Everything became part of a puzzle that I put together in silence. I found out his name. I discovered his work. I even found out where he lived. And it was then that I realized something even more devastating: he wasn't just any adventurer. He was someone close. A face that has already crossed mine at parties, dinners and events. A face that once smiled at me. Little by little, I started to draw up my plan. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was poetic justice. I wouldn't just destroy their case. I would put them face to face with their own rot. It would make them see themselves in the mirror of shame. But this required patience. Coldness. And a final piece that made it all worth it. Something they never expected. And I found this piece. She was in front of me the whole time. This was someone who also knew the pain of betrayal. Someone who, ironically, was at the epicenter of that triangle, but from a different angle. Someone with whom I shared tears and silence, without knowing that something greater than pain was born there. There was the end of a cycle. And the beginning of another. Because there are betrayals that cannot be retaliated with shouting or fighting. They fight back intelligently. With elegance. And with the sweetest form of revenge, happiness. But before that, I still needed to finish my plan. I needed her to believe that nothing had changed. That I was still blind. That she was still fooling a fool. And she believed. She fell. Planned another night with him. Another dinner. Another date. Little did I know that, this time, the table would be different. And the show I prepared would be the last act of a story she would never forget. She thought she destroyed me. But it only awakened something dormant. Something that would now make her taste her own medicine. I followed everything. Every step. Every lie. And what she didn't imagine was that at the end of that night, who would be waiting for her, was someone she would never have imagined finding there. And what happened afterwards? That you'll have to find out. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. All stories are fictional, created with the sole purpose of showing, in an intense and realistic way, how infidelity destroys homes, corrodes feelings and shatters lives. The moral is clear: whoever cheats always pays the price. Get ready now for a shocking story, full of emotion, twists and consequences. Take a deep breath, because what's next will mark you. There was something deeply harmonious in the way Daniel and Sophia walked side by side on Sunday mornings, as if the time between them had been shaped to fit their routine, their gestures and even their silences. They had been married for 13 years, but the impression they gave was of a connection built on layers of complicity, respect and memories. The house where they lived was a subtle reflection of this, without exaggerated luxuries, but steeped in history in every detail: the black and white photos on the staircase wall, the books arranged by emotional affinity on the living room shelves, and the old desk that Daniel restored with his own hands and which now served as Sophia's favorite reading corner. They both had stable jobs, and although they didn't live between trips and big dinners, they knew how to find pleasure in small everyday celebrations: an impromptu cake on a rainy afternoon, an out-of-hour coffee in the middle of the night, a silly dance to the sound of some forgotten song on the car radio. They had a 7-year-old son, Lucas, a boy with lively eyes and an easy smile, who seemed to bring together the best of both, Daniel's curiosity and Sophia's serene sweetness. Daniel was a civil engineer. I liked numbers, well-defined structures, projects with a clear beginning, middle and end. But there was a sensitivity in him that didn't usually come with the rigidity of exacts. He spoke little, but when he did speak, he chose his words well. He was one of those men who listen with their entire body, attentive not only to what is said, but to what is hidden between the lines. He liked watching Sophia when she drew, admiring the precise strokes with which she gave life to ideas that came out of nowhere. Sophia was an architect and had a small studio at the back of the house, where she spent hours in silence creating, redesigning, adjusting perspectives. It was his refuge, but also his battlefield, where he confronted insecurities, questioned choices and searched for meaning. She has always been an intense but discreet woman. She had a delicacy that was not fragile, but firm, built with the pain of mistakes and the joy of achievements. The couple's life wasn't perfect, and they knew it. Like any long-term relationship, they faced cycles of distance and reunion, moments of boredom and passion, silent frustrations and deep reconciliations. But, on the whole, there was a tacit agreement of loyalty and presence between them. Not the romanticized kind, but those that are built in small everyday attitudes, the message left on the fridge before leaving, the improvised note hidden in the wallet, the touch on the hand during some dinner. In the eyes of outsiders, they were an example of what many called a mature relationship. And maybe they were. They had gone through financial crises, sleepless nights with Lucas crying, and even the mourning of Sophia's father, which shook their structures for a while. Still, they continued there, hand in hand, choosing each other even without solemn promises, just because of the custom of being together. That year, Sophia had received an invitation to participate in a contemporary architecture exhibition in another city, a project that she had dreamed of for a long time, but that she always postponed because of the priorities of the house, Lucas, and their life together. Daniel was the first to encourage her to accept. She said it was her chance to reconnect with something that always made her shine inside. He said he would take care of everything around here, that Lucas and he would find a way, that she deserved that experience. Sophia hesitated, as she always did when faced with something that involved thinking about herself before everyone else, but in the end, she accepted. He would only be away for a few days, and the two agreed to keep in touch by video every day. When saying goodbye, Daniel insisted on taking her to the airport. When she boarded, he stood still for a few seconds watching the aircraft go away, and a pang of anticipatory longing grew in his chest. It wasn't just the physical absence. It was as if, suddenly, something had moved out of place inside him. But he pushed the thought aside, took a deep breath and went home. The days that Sophia was away were surprisingly organized. Daniel tried his best to make sure Lucas didn't feel his mother's absence like a void. He took his son to the park, cooked the family's favorite recipes and even risked helping with schoolwork. On video calls with Sophia, he smiled, told the day's events in detail and made a point of showing how much the house continued to function, even without her there. Sophia also looked happy. In the videos, her eyes sparkled with an energy Daniel hadn't seen in a while. She talked about the project with excitement, talked about the colleagues she was working with and said how important it was to her. Daniel felt proud, but also slightly uneasy. Not out of jealousy, but because he realized there was a side of her he had forgotten to nurture. A side that, perhaps, she herself had forgotten. And now, far away, it bloomed as if it had never been pruned. When she returned, she brought more than just papers and sketches in her suitcase. It brought a new enthusiasm, a renewed confidence. Daniel noticed the difference on the first day. It was as if Sophia had returned with the certainty that something inside her had changed. Her eyes seemed more alive, her skin more luminous, her gestures lighter. She spoke about architecture with a passion that he remembered from the time they started dating, when she would draw on napkins and say that one day she would create something that would change the world. That glow was back, and Daniel struggled to keep up. I didn't want to lose track, I didn't want to be left behind. The days passed with a strangely gentle atmosphere. Quiet dinners, spontaneous laughter, long hugs at the end of the night. But there was something in the silences that Daniel still couldn't decipher. It wasn't distance, nor coldness. It was distraction. Sophia always seemed a little beyond there, as if something was calling her away even when she was present. Daniel tried not to think too much. She wanted to believe it was just the side effect of an intense project, of a return to what she loved doing. After all, there was no reason to doubt her. They have always been transparent with each other. Or at least that's what he believed. What Daniel still didn't know was that that cycle that seemed like the beginning of a new phase was, in fact, the surface of something much deeper. The dynamic between them was changing, albeit imperceptibly. Small decisions began to be made without dialogue. Sophia started spending more time in the studio, finishing projects until late. Daniel, in turn, immersed himself in his work even more, trying to maintain a balance in the house without showing the tiredness that was growing within him. Both believed they were doing their best. But the space between them expanded silently, like cracks appearing in the walls of an old house, almost invisible at first, until the moment they became impossible to ignore. Even so, on the outside, everything remained intact. They continued to be the couple admired by their friends, the exemplary parents, the discreet and cordial neighbors. Conversations with Lucas were always light, weekends were full of walks and laughter. No one could have imagined that beneath the surface of that stability, there was a growing tension, silent but persistent. Like a rope stretched to its maximum, about to break. And it was in this context that the story really began to unfold. When Daniel decided to reorganize the office shelf and found a forgotten paper among the books. A simple ticket. A short sentence. And a handwritten date. Nothing compromising at first glance. But it was enough to spark a feeling within him. A loose thread in the fabric of the routine he knew so well. He didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't talk to Sophia. He just kept the note in his pocket and, that night, he lay down next to her as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He just didn't know how much yet. And it was just the beginning. Daniel spent the next few days trying to convince himself that the note found among the books was just an ordinary note, something unimportant, perhaps a reminder for a work dinner or a harmless invitation between colleagues. But as much as he wanted to believe this version, there was something about the way the words were written that bothered him. It wasn't the content itself, but the tone, the way the male handwriting seemed too intimate, too safe, as if whoever had written it didn't fear discovery. The name signed, in the lower corner of the paper, was common, a name that Daniel had certainly heard somewhere, but that at that moment he could not associate with any face. He folded the note carefully and put it inside an old box in the closet, where he kept things he preferred not to see every day, but couldn't bring himself to throw away. From then on, he started paying more attention. Not in what Sophia said, but in what she didn't say. He began to notice the silences after the cell phone rang, the smiles that ended before the end of the sentence, the messages she typed with her body facing away. Still, he preferred to remain silent. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I was afraid I was seeing too much. Or worse, fear of being right. The weeks passed and, with them, the evidence began to accumulate like dust that no one cleans up for fear of what might appear underneath. Sophia started to be absent more frequently, citing meetings, project deliveries, visits to clients. It was justifiable. She was always dedicated to her work, always pursued her own achievements. Daniel didn't want to question this, he didn't want to become that kind of man who controls, who distrusts everything. But instinct spoke louder. He began to discreetly write down the times she left and returned, mentally crossing the information with the commitments she said she had. He began to do this not out of revenge, but to protect himself from the doubt that was gnawing at him inside. His heart wavered between the hope that he was mistaken and the fear that he was being ridiculed. One Friday night, after putting Lucas to sleep, Daniel went to the office and turned on Sophia's laptop. She had forgotten to close a browser tab, something rare, as she was always careful about her privacy. It was a restaurant reservation page, with a confirmation scheduled for the following Saturday. He didn't comment anything. He guarded the information like someone guarding a loaded gun. On Saturday morning, Sophia mentioned that she would have lunch with a client and then a field visit that could last until the early evening. Daniel nodded, showing calm, and said he would take advantage of the day to take Lucas to the movies. She smiled, kissed him and left. But Daniel didn't go to the cinema. He left Lucas with his grandmother and followed Sophia's footsteps with the precision of someone who already knew what he was looking for. He stopped the car 2 blocks from the reserved restaurant, entered through a side entrance and sat strategically at a table with a wide view of the room. The place was elegant, discreet, frequented by couples and executives. When she entered, Daniel felt his entire body tense. Sophia wore a dark blue dress that he knew well. It was the dress she had bought for their wedding anniversary 2 years ago. The hair tied into a light bun, the makeup subtle but impeccable. She discreetly looked around before sitting down. Alone. For a few minutes, he sat on his cell phone, then ordered a glass of wine and continued waiting. Daniel almost believed that it was all a business lunch. Until he arrived. A man with an elegant appearance, a confident smile, a well-groomed beard, a shirt folded over his forearms. He approached the table naturally and kissed Sophia on the cheek, but with more time than necessary, with an intimacy that Daniel knew very well. The conversation flowed lightly. They laughed, looked into each other's eyes, toasted as if they were celebrating something that no one else there understood. Daniel watched in silence, fighting the storm brewing inside him. I didn't know if I felt angry, sad or just empty. It was as if he were watching a play where the main character, himself, had been replaced by another without warning. Dinner lasted almost 2 hours. When she got up to go to the bathroom, the man took the opportunity to use his cell phone and Daniel, taken by an impulse, left the restaurant discreetly. The confirmation he needed was right in front of him. And now that I knew, there was no point in continuing to watch. He returned to the car and sat there, staring at the steering wheel as if it were the only fixed point in the reality that had just shattered. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just took a deep breath and started the engine. During the following days, Sophia's presence at home began to have a bitter taste. Daniel watched her with different eyes. Her gestures, once familiar, now seemed rehearsed. The hugs, the kisses, the looks, everything carried an artificiality that he could no longer ignore. Her laughter seemed more distant. Her scent, colder. And the touch, lighter. Sophia was still the woman he knew, but at the same time, she was a stranger. Someone who shared the same roof, but whose thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed to understand how far it went, how big the lie was, how many days, how many nights had been shared with someone else without him noticing. And he needed to remain calm, for his son, for his appearance, for himself. But with each passing day, the pressure increased. It was like carrying a glass full of water on your head, knowing that at any moment, the slightest movement would cause it to overflow. Until the night came when everything came together in a cruel way. Sophia left again, this time saying she was having a get-together with old college friends. Daniel nodded. This time he didn't follow her. Just waited. Hours later, when she returned, she entered the house with her heels in hand, her hair loose and her lipstick a little smudged. Daniel was waiting for her in the living room, sitting in silence. She was scared to see him there, but tried to hide it. She said it had been a long night, that she was tired, that she just wanted to take a shower and sleep. He didn't respond. He just got up, walked to the door and locked it with the key. Sophia stood still, staring at him without understanding. And that was when Daniel took the old note out of his pocket, now crumpled and stained from the hours it had been between his sweaty fingers. He asked, in a low voice, who that man was. Sophia hesitated for a second. Then he tried to laugh, tried to turn everything into a misunderstanding, but his voice broke. Daniel didn't scream. There was no scandal. He just walked to his room and came back with a folder. Inside, photos. Images of her with the same man in 2 other restaurants. Printed conversations. Prints. Dates. Schedules. All the evidence I had gathered. He put everything on the table. Sophia turned pale. The hands were shaking. He tried to touch Daniel, but he moved away. And then, in a broken whisper, she confirmed. I said yes. What had happened? That it wasn't what it seemed. That I was confused. That he didn't know how he let that happen. But it was too late. Daniel didn't say anything else. He just went upstairs, closed the bedroom door and spent the night awake. The sky began to lighten and he was still sitting, motionless, trying to understand how to rebuild what was torn apart without warning. I thought about Lucas, I thought about the house, I thought about the years. But most of all, I thought about what to do with it. The next morning, when he went downstairs, he found Sophia sitting in the kitchen, her eyes red, her arms crossed over her chest. She tried to start a conversation, but he just grabbed his car keys and left. I needed air. Of time. Space to think. He didn't know it yet, but the betrayal was just the surface. There was something even deeper hidden behind it all. Something that would come to light very soon. And when it came, it would change not just their marriage, but the course of their entire lives. The day after the confrontation, Daniel did not return home. He spent the night in a small, remote hotel, one of those without luxury, with a hard mattress and scratchy sheets, but which offered what he needed most at that moment, distance. Of her smell, of the walls of the house, of the vivid memory of a now poisoned touch. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last few months, searching for signs, patterns, unasked questions. In the morning, he looked at his cell phone for the first time and found more than 10 messages from Sophia, all with variations of the same request: "We need to talk, please listen to me, you need to know everything." But Daniel didn't want to know anything else. I already knew enough. She had lied, betrayed, invaded the only space he believed to be inviolable, their home, their story. He left the room, paid cash and returned to the car. Only when he put his hands on the steering wheel did he realize he had nowhere to go. And then, he did what was perhaps the most unlikely thing: he went to the house of the man with whom she had cheated on him. He parked on the other side of the street, observing the closed gate, the impeccable garden, the large windows covered by thin curtains. It was an upscale, calm neighborhood, with houses far enough away to guarantee privacy, but close enough to make any scandal become a comment. Daniel got out of the car, crossed the street slowly and rang the doorbell. A minute later, the door opened. And whoever appeared was not the man he expected. It was a firm-looking woman, perhaps 10 years older than him, with tightly tied hair and a serious expression. Daniel hesitated. He thought about inventing something, asking for someone else, backing off. But he just said her name and asked if her partner was home. She looked at him for long seconds, as if she were studying him, until she said no, but that he could come in if he wanted to leave a message. He accepted. He entered the room, noticed the frames on the sideboard, the family photos, the frames with children, trips, birthdays. It was a living house, with history, with ties. And Daniel, who was preparing to confront a man, ended up being surprised by something that completely disarmed him. The woman asked him to sit down and offered him coffee. He refused. He said he was there for a specific reason. He said coldly that his wife and the man in question were having an affair. I expected an explosive reaction, a denial, a shock. But she just took a deep breath, lowered her eyes and replied with a tone that mixed pain and a certain tiredness: "I know." Daniel was taken by surprise. She went on to say that she found out months earlier, but that she chose not to confront him immediately. I hoped it would be temporary, that it would end on its own. She said her husband had changed a lot since his sister's death. That he closed himself off, that he stopped speaking, that he became an absent man. And that, deep down, she herself no longer knew if it was still a wedding or just a formality with too many memories to be discarded. Daniel heard everything in silence. At some point, he realized that what he felt inside was no longer just anger. It was a shame. It was identification. It was seeing yourself in the mirror, but with the reflection of someone who had already learned to deal with that pain. When he got up to leave, he thanked him for his sincerity. But before leaving, the woman said there was something he needed to know. Something that changed the place of everything he had understood until then. And, without changing his tone of voice, he said that the man his wife had gotten involved with had not been the first. That she knew with absolute certainty that the two had crossed paths before, years ago. That his name was on the list of participants for a professional trip that Sophia took 5 years ago. Daniel tried to rebut, to say that she could be wrong. But the woman said that, on that trip, her husband was still using another professional name. And that's when it all started to make sense. Daniel left that house as if he were carrying an impossible weight. He started the car, drove aimlessly, his eyes fixed on the emptiness ahead. He only stopped when he realized he was parked in front of the building where the city's most prestigious art gallery was located. The same place where Sophia dreamed of exhibiting her works. He went down, entered, walked through the space as if he were hypnotized, until he found one of the curators with whom he had exchanged emails some time ago, when he had secretly planned a surprise for his wife. He introduced himself, confirmed the reservation of the space for Sophia's exhibition and said he would like to make a small change. He asked the curator to keep the event as it was, but to allow an extra work, by anonymous author, to be included in the last room of the gallery. Something personal, intimate. She agreed without raising objections, impressed by the calmness of the man who had a blindfold in his eyes. During the following weeks, Daniel remained distant, cold, but present enough not to arouse suspicion. He spent time with Lucas, maintained a household routine and responded to Sophia's attempts to approach him with a mechanical courtesy, as if everything was being observed by an invisible judge. And she, feeling the change, looked for ways to rebuild the bridge she had burned. She sent affectionate messages, prepared dishes he liked, left notes like before. But nothing had any effect. Daniel was no longer the same. Something inside him had changed. And she knew. She felt it. The day of the exhibition arrived. Sophia got ready with enthusiasm, wearing a new dress and a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been seen in a long time. I was nervous, anxious, hopeful. Daniel accompanied her, as always, keeping his face calm and his smile formal. When they arrived at the gallery, they were greeted with discreet applause and polite greetings. Sophia walked among the works with an air of gratitude, proud of what she had created. Until, in the last room, she stopped. In front of the central piece, the only anonymous work of the night. A mural composed of collages, photographs, printed messages, fragments of dialogues and notes intertwined with images of family moments, screenshots, traces of deleted conversations. At the top, a handwritten phrase, "Everything you hide between smiles, time reveals in silence." Sophia felt her legs give out. He lacked air. He read each piece of that mural as if he were reading his own sentence. She looked to the side and saw Daniel standing still, with his eyes fixed on her. No anger. No pain. Just an immense void that said it all. She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. She tried to touch his arm, but he moved away with a light, almost imperceptible gesture. And then, in front of everyone, she knew she had lost. Not just the husband. But the only person who had truly believed in her. In the days that followed, Sophia no longer tried to justify herself. I knew it would be useless. But what she still didn't know was that life was preparing an even bigger turnaround. Because in the midst of the destruction, Daniel found something he never expected. Something that began with a shy exchange of glances, after the exhibition, with someone who was there, discreetly observing from afar. A woman who knew well the pain of betrayal, and who, ironically, had been part of Sophia's life for much longer than she could imagine. And when their paths crossed again, a long-kept secret would come to light, turning Daniel's revenge into something far beyond what anyone could have predicted. As the crowd began to disperse into the gallery, the room once filled with cheers and flashbulbs turned into a minefield of averted glances and subdued whispers. Sophia stood in front of the installation for minutes that seemed to have no end, with her eyes fixed on the clippings that told of her own downfall. He didn't cry. It didn't explode. He just stood there, as if his body had stopped obeying him. Daniel, in turn, had already left the gallery. I didn't want applause, nor witnesses for that moment. The exhibition wasn't for the public, it was for her. The mask had fallen, and now she had to deal with the rubble. His car left without a sound, cutting through the night like a silent farewell, and no one knew for sure what the next step would be. Neither does he. The next morning, Sophia arrived home and found it empty. On the kitchen table, a carefully folded sheet. It wasn't a letter. Just one sentence written in his favorite handwriting, Daniel's, "Now you know the sound of silence itself." She sat down, this time letting the tears come. There was no longer any reason to resist. The shame was so much that it hurt my body. The son was at his grandmother's house, as agreed, and that weekend, the world became too small to contain the weight of the choices she had made. For hours, she sat in the same place, surrounded by absence. Memories echoed between the walls, but they no longer belonged to him. He tried calling Daniel dozens of times, but every call went to voicemail. No messages were displayed. He had disappeared, and that, for her, was the worst possible punishment. Daniel, however, was not running away. I was in another place, in a simple house, with walls covered in old paintings and the smell of recently brewed coffee. The home of Helena, the betrayed wife of the man Sophia had gotten involved with. Since the night of the exhibition, the two began exchanging short, discreet messages, like someone testing the water temperature before diving. Helena was an intelligent woman, with slow, firm speech, but with a look that revealed layers of sadness so similar to the ones he carried. Talking to her was like meeting someone who spoke the same language of pain. There were no judgments between them, just a mutual understanding that, in that moment, they were both trying to rebuild something from what was destroyed. Helena, with her silent sensitivity, offered him not answers, but listening. And that, for Daniel, was more valuable than any explanation. On the second day they spent there, sitting at the kitchen table, the two began to tell each other details that until then they had kept to themselves. Helena spoke about her childhood with her husband, about how he was always charismatic, charming, but also impatient and insatiable. He said his marriage had never been turbulent, just lukewarm. Daniel talked about how he met Sophia, the sleepless nights building the home, the small gestures that kept everything working. And then, at a point where words began to fail, Helena got up, went to her room and came back with a folder. Inside, papers. Copies of old emails, bank statements, travel records made under false names. All pointing to something much bigger than just a recent betrayal. Daniel leafed through the content without understanding at first. Until, among the leaves, he saw a familiar image. A photo of Sophia, years before, smiling alongside Helena's husband at an architecture conference in Lisbon. The detail was there, the event caption did not display his real name. He used a professional pseudonym, something Daniel never knew. And it was then that Helena revealed what she had recently discovered, the relationship between the two had been going on for a long time. It wasn't something temporary, nor was it impulsive. It was a story that repeated itself, cyclical, silent, intermittent. The first time was 5 years earlier, and after that, there were other meetings, always camouflaged under work trips and side projects. Sophia and he had grown apart, yes, but they never really disconnected. The revelation fell upon Daniel like a second betrayal, deeper, more cruel. It wasn't just the pain of the present, it was the realization that the last years of his life had been partially manipulated. That while he celebrated achievements, raised his son and built memories, there was another side of the story being lived in the shadows. And there, sitting in front of Helena, the only person who could understand that pain with surgical precision, he broke the silence he had maintained since the exposure. He said he now understood why Sophia's eyes were so far away. That the absence he felt was not something recent. It was the reflection of a divided presence, of a woman who lived two lives and chose lies as a bridge between them. That night, Daniel didn't come home. He remained in Helena's company until dawn, in a conversation that dissolved into confidences and long silences. And when the sun rose, they both knew, without needing to say, that something had changed. It wasn't love yet, it wasn't desire, but it was a meeting point. A place where pain had given way to something lighter, quieter, but immensely truer. Meanwhile, Sophia walked around the house like a ghost. She tried to fill her time with useless tasks, but nothing distracted her from the anguish of not hearing from him. He called his in-laws, friends, even his son's school, trying to understand if Daniel had left a message. Nothing. She began to think that maybe he was gone for good. That I had taken my bags, my dreams, the remains of what was left and simply given up on everything. And that thought, more than any accusation, consumed her. On the fourth day, he finally appeared. He didn't say where he had been, nor did he make any attempt to discuss it. He just went in, called Lucas, spent a few hours with his son and, before leaving again, called Sophia to talk. They sat on the balcony, the same place where they shared wine so many times, laughed about silly things and made plans. But now the climate was different. She started to speak, but he interrupted her. He said he didn't want justifications, that he had already heard too much. That there was a difference between a mistake and a constant choice. And that, as much as it hurt, he was at peace with the decision not to try anymore. Sophia, with teary eyes, asked if anyone was there. The question came in a choked voice, almost like a last attempt at control, at predictability. And Daniel, with a calm that came from certainty, answered no. But there was someone, yes, who understood what he felt. Someone who, ironically, she herself helped bring together. Sophia's reaction was immediate. Her face paled, and what seemed like a simple realization became an emotional punch. She understood. Helena. And, at that moment, he realized that his betrayal not only destroyed his marriage, but also opened space for something he could never control. Daniel said goodbye to Lucas, grabbed a backpack and left. Sophia stood there, standing still, listening to the sound of the door closing with the exact slowness of a definitive goodbye. And deep down, I knew there was no going back. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of the image she had of herself. Of what was. Of what he pretended to be. And what you lost because you never chose clearly. That same day, Daniel returned to Helena's house. He didn't take flowers or promises. It took silence, a sincere look, a heart emptied of sorrow. And when she opened the door, he just said, "Can I come in?" There was no rush. There were no plans. Just two wounded paths, crossing towards something that, for the first time in a long time, looked clean. True. Fair. What was born from that pain still had no name, but it was already beginning to show its shape. And that form, finally, was theirs. That morning arrived with a different clarity, not because the sky was bluer or the sun stronger, but because there was, finally, a definitive silence inside Daniel. A silence that didn't hurt, didn't scream, just accompanied his movements with a new lightness, like someone who accepts that some wars can't be won, they can be overcome. The backpack leaning against the corner of Helena's house still didn't have a certain destination, but it was no longer a symbol of escape. It was just part of the process. And even though the conversations between them were still marked by pauses and hesitations, there was a common ground being cultivated there, where empathy took the place of haste and lucidity gave shape to what could or could not flourish. Daniel didn't look for comfort, and Helena didn't offer promises. What existed between them was honesty, a very rare thing after living with lies for so long. The days that followed were marked by a calm that strangely brought comfort. Daniel gradually returned to taking care of his commitments, resuming his work, restructuring his schedule with his son, and reorganizing the practical aspects of his life. But now he did everything with a closer eye on what really mattered. I spent more time with Lucas, not just in the obligatory moments of the routine, but creating situations to truly be together. She relearned to listen to him, to get lost in the invented stories of a curious boy, to laugh without feeling guilty, to be moved by the simple way he had of understanding the world. And it was in this reunion with his son that Daniel realized that there was still a lot to rebuild, not between him and Sophia, but within himself, and between him and what was left of his own convictions. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Sophia was living time like someone trying to hold water flowing between her fingers. He tried to continue with his professional commitments, but the projects no longer made sense. The compliments that once filled his ego now seemed ironic. Messages stopped arriving, invitations became scarcer. She realized how much her image was linked to Daniel's presence and the silent admiration he always had for her. Without him, it was as if she had lost the mirror in which she saw herself as an admirable woman. The couple's friends, who previously orbited their lives naturally, were now torn between diplomacy and distancing. Sophia found herself alone at dinners that used to be a couple, on nights that used to end with the sound of his voice telling a bedtime story. The bed seemed bigger, the house colder, and the reflection in the mirror harder to look at. She tried to get closer to Lucas with more intensity, to make up for what she knew she had caused, but the naturalness was no longer there. The child loved her, but she also felt the invisible tension between her parents, even without understanding the complex layers of what had happened. Sophia tried, and maybe that's why it hurt more. Because her effort came too late. She couldn't turn back time, nor Daniel's gaze. As much as she tried to justify her mistakes as lapses, as internal confusion, as desperate searches for a piece of herself that she felt she had lost, everything seemed shallow compared to the depth of what she destroyed. And it was in this process of looking at herself without filters that she began to question what actually led her there. He discovered, reluctantly, that his choices were not accidental. They were symptoms of an old wound, of unspoken dissatisfaction, of a loneliness that began long before Daniel. And, even more difficult, he understood that he was not the villain of his story, he was its most silent victim. Daniel, in turn, no longer carried that hot, consuming pain. Now the pain was cold, clear, and it made him stronger. Little by little, he allowed Helena's presence to stop being just company in solitude and start to mean a real possibility of a new beginning. There was no rush between them, and perhaps that was what made everything more true. She didn't demand anything. He didn't promise anything. But the shared coffees, the films watched side by side, the divided silences already said much more than any words. Lucas, naturally, began to approach her. He found the way she played with him funny, he liked listening to the stories of his grown children, he felt at ease in her presence. And Daniel, observing this spontaneous connection, understood that perhaps life was, in some way, making room for something new, more complete, more mature. The dilemma that was forming within him, however, was not small. Because forgiving Sophia didn't mean going back. And moving forward didn't mean erasing it from history itself. She was also the mother of his son. It was part of who he was, the joys he experienced, the moments that were real. He didn't want to erase the past. Yes, I wanted to learn to live with him in a different way. But that required something that was yet to come, the moment when he would have to face the official end head-on. The final decision on divorce, on custody, on the house, on memories. Everything that until then he had postponed in the name of Lucas's stability and his own sanity. The notice for the hearing arrived by email on a gray Tuesday. Upon reading the details, Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. Not because of bureaucracy, but because of symbolism. It was the final point. It was the moment when the two would have to verbalize, in front of other people, that they no longer belonged to the same story. And as much as I wanted the end, I also feared the weight of the official goodbye. The night before the hearing, he went for a walk. He walked along streets that he had walked through for years, passing through places where he had memorable conversations with Sophia, where he saw his son take his first steps, where he celebrated small victories that now seemed distant. Memory was not his enemy, but it was like a wall where the marks of time could no longer be removed. It was necessary to accept that not all pain is forever, but some scars are. On the day of the hearing, he found Sophia in the courthouse waiting room. She was visibly nervous, her eyes were tired and her hands were shaking. He tried to smile, but there was no reciprocity. Daniel just nodded, sitting next to her, but keeping his distance. When they were called, they followed in silence. They signed the documents, listened to the judge's formalities, agreed to the terms. And when they left there, they stopped for a moment in the outer courtyard. Sophia, her voice breaking, said she knew she had destroyed more than her marriage. Who was aware that her actions caused cracks not only in him, but in herself. And that, even though I didn't expect forgiveness, I wanted to at least thank him for not taking everything to the extreme. Daniel took a deep breath, looked into her eyes and responded with a new serenity that forgiveness, sometimes, doesn't come as a gesture, but as an intimate decision not to let the past determine the future. He said he hoped she too would find a way to rebuild herself, but away from him. And then, he left. That night, Daniel returned to Helena's house. Lucas was already asleep in the next room, and she was waiting for him with 2 cups of tea. They sat together on the porch, where the wind blew gently and the night seemed less heavy. He told what had happened, not with regret, but with the ease of someone who had finally turned the last page of a long and turbulent chapter. Helena listened to him in silence, holding his hand lightly, without invading, just present. And it was there, on that simple balcony, without promises, without expectations, that Daniel realized that maybe love wasn't what he had idealized all these years. Maybe that's what real love would be, someone who sits next to you at the end of a cycle and, even without knowing what will come next, chooses to stay. Not because you need to, but because you want to. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted it too. Not because of lack, not because of pain. But because, finally, I was whole again. And ready for what came next. Months have passed since the papers were signed. Life, with its relentless force, did not ask for permission to continue. The seasons changed without warning, as they always do, and what was once stabbing pain turned into a strange kind of bearable silence. Daniel, now officially living at another address, had managed to transform the grief of the end into raw material for an unexpectedly beautiful reconstruction. The house was modest, but filled with small details that represented new beginnings, plants he patiently cultivated, photos of recent moments with his son, simple objects with history and presence. The days became lighter and the routine more peaceful, not because of the absence of challenges, but because of the full presence of a peace that he had never really known. He was no longer looking for an idealized version of happiness, but rather a place where his soul could breathe without weight, without a mask, without veiled anguish. Helena, in turn, found in Daniel's calmness a kind of rescue of what she had lost in herself. She no longer carried the hurts of the past, nor did she expect redemption from anyone. His life, once marked by silent concessions, gained a new layer of authenticity. His adult children, who were initially suspicious of his closeness to Daniel, realized over time that there was no disguised lack there, but rather choice. The conscious choice to follow alongside someone who understood her without the need for many words. The two did not label themselves, they did not draw up grandiose plans, but each daily gesture was filled with intention and real affection. They shared dinners, took care of Lucas together, laughed at nonsense with a lightness that only those who have suffered deeply can understand. What was born between them was not the result of revenge, but of identification. Not a replacement, but an evolution. Sophia, on the other hand, faced a completely different scenario. After the divorce, he tried to resume his career with the same strength as before, but discovered that the name he had built was now tarnished by something bigger than a scandal. It was corroded by an internal emptiness that could no longer be ignored. Projects stopped flowing naturally, praise gave way to a silent type of judgment that followed her wherever she went. Conversations with friends became more sparse, and even professional partnerships began to falter in the face of his unstable image. More than that, she began to constantly question whether that glow she felt in the past was really hers, or whether it had been sustained by the silent love she always had by her side and which she never knew how to value while she was there. The man she got involved with also disappeared from her life. After his public revelation at the exhibition, he was confronted by his wife, faced a painful separation process and lost the respect of a large part of his professional network. He tried to contact Sophia a few times, but she ignored him. Not out of pride, but out of shame. He realized that, contrary to what he had imagined, that involvement never had depth. It was just an escape, a distraction from an emptiness she refused to face. Over time, she found herself alone. He tried to find some meaning in therapy groups, he sought spiritual reconnection, he tried to regain family ties. But what consumed her was not physical loneliness, it was the constant echo of the absence of herself. The betrayal she committed not only destroyed the other, but also what was most intact within her. The moral dilemma he began to face was as complex as it was cruel. It wasn't just about losing a husband, a home, or the admiration of acquaintances. It was about dealing with the daily reminder that, by her own choice, she destroyed the only place where she was truly loved. And no one took that away from her but herself. She tried to get closer to Lucas, and although he never rejected her, there was an invisible distance between them, like a border that separated the memory of the loving mother of the past from the image of the woman who now tried to fix what was no longer fixable. He suffered in silence, because he knew that nothing he did would erase what he caused. Daniel, upon noticing Sophia's timid effort, decided to maintain a cordial relationship with her in his son's name. He never encouraged bitterness between Lucas and his mother, nor did he allow bitterness to contaminate conversations. But he was firm. He established limits, made it clear that his life was now heading in a different direction. And even in the most trivial exchanges, the difference in his eyes was visible. There was compassion, but there was no longer affection. There was respect for the shared history, but there was no longer room for any rapprochement. It was the kind of ending that didn't scream, but that sealed all paths back with an irreversible silence. Over time, Daniel and Helena started to build something that neither of them had imagined at the beginning. They traveled together for the first time, not to escape anything, but to create new memories. They shared real laughs, the kind that don't need a reason, just presence. And there, in the simple act of sharing a sunset, an evening wine or a conversation about the day, they found something that no longer required definitions. It was love. A love that was born from destruction, but made whole. A love that didn't ask for proof, that didn't live on idealizations, but on the truth. And this truth sustained them more strongly than any previous covenant. Sophia, little by little, stopped looking for redemption outside and started making the only possible move, diving inward. He started writing letters that he never sent, revisiting old projects with a less vain, more humble outlook. She began volunteering at a support center for women in crisis. There, for the first time in a long time, she was heard without judgment, and heard stories that helped her understand her own. He discovered that no matter how unforgivable his mistake was, he could still find some way to get back on his feet. Not with applause, not with recognition, but with consistency. With a new way of living that was no longer based on appearance, but on integrity. Lucas grew up with the memory of a home that was broken, but not destroyed. He saw his father rebuild his life with dignity, he learned from him the value of silence and firmness. He saw his mother lose herself and find herself again, and even without understanding all the details, he realized that adult life is made up of choices that exact a high price. He grew up surrounded by truths, even painful ones, and this made him more sensitive, stronger, more attentive to what really matters. Daniel and Helena raised him with a sense of justice and affection that marked him deeply. And, at the end of it all, what remained for each of those involved was the certainty that, however devastating the path of betrayal may be, it can also be the beginning of a painful, but necessary, process of reuniting with who we really are. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? What was the moment that marked you the most? Leave your opinion here in the comments, I'd love to know what you think. And of course, if you've made it this far and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Every week you will find impactful, intense and completely human stories here. Stories that show how choices have consequences and that, above all, here we do not support any type of betrayal. Quite the opposite, we show in depth how it destroys, corrodes and changes lives forever. See you in the next story.